The word of the Lord to Job. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Some months ago at Tennessee Wesleyan College, the chaplain told his audience of 400, "There are no words of assurance, for there is no one to assure us." And then the black-robed choir in turn intoned a different kind of liturgy than we're used to here. The liturgy went, "God is dead." These are real feelings expressed by concerned Christians. It is not sophomoric atheism or classical atheism, or certainly not the earthy and crude atheism of Madeleine Murray. It is rather disbelief rather than unbelief even. By disbelief, we mean a positive rejection of something that is stated or asserted. Unbelief is more an utter lack of or an absence of belief. Disbelief then sometimes moves within the circle of the church. Why would a choir chant, "God is dead," and a Christian chaplain assure his listeners that there are no words of assurance? The sources of disbelief are, of course, many and varied. I would like to consider only one very briefly this morning, but one which is primary and probably the classical reason for doubt and estrangement. It has to do with meaningless suffering. Camus, in his novel The Plague, gives splendid contemporary expression to this whole question. The doctor who treats his innocent patients can find no real reason to believe in God because of the suffering of these innocents. A little innocent child dies of the plague, and the doctor asks the priest how such innocent suffering might be justified at the hands of a good God. This is indeed an ancient question. If God is good, how then can he permit the innocent to suffer? How can he prevent meaningless suffering? If God were good, then he would prevent it. And then one might draw an inevitable but rational conclusion of sorts. If God is good, but he cannot prevent such things as meaningless suffering to happen, then God is not all-powerful. God is good, but he's weak, or in theological language, he's somewhat finite. It is as expressed in Green Pastures. It ain't easy being God. To the college student, the problem of the finitude of God, or the inability of God, or even the absence of God is understood, it seems. Biology students fond of studying the wonder of onrushing evolutionary processes know well enough that not all evolutionary processes work out to glorious adapted ends. Not all species survive. In fact, one might even argue that evolutionary processes seem almost as purposeless as they seem purposeful. There is cruel and irrational waste, and species seem to move in aimless futility. There seem to be no ends toward which some of the processes seem to work. A Tombstone lyric said it well. If she was so soon done for, I wonder what she was begun for. God, you see, seems like a spirit in difficulties. He constantly experiments, but is not always sure about what he is doing or what the processes are. he can't always control the processes. Compelling also to the modern sense of disbelief is the meaninglessness of much suffering. Clergymen are often confronted with this problem. I remember a young parishioner of mine who became violently ill, and everybody assured him that things would turn out well in the end, that he ought to have faith and he ought to pray. And he received baskets of flowers and scads of ghastly get-well cards. And the deacons prayed for him, and the community was with him all the way. God's will be done. Everything will be all right, they said. There's only one problem. He died. Some suffering does seem meaningless. This parishioner seemed so, unless you'd say that he is in heaven with stars in his crown. But to say that perhaps is to evade the real issue of suffering. It doesn't help very much to say that, perhaps. It is possible that some suffering is so cruel and so irrational and so irreducibly evil that it would be very, very difficult, perhaps impossible, to define it as good, no matter which way you cut the cake. I guess if you were an idiot son, it would be very difficult for your parents to define this in terms of goodness or benefit. Perhaps when you sent your grades home, your parents asked that question. If you had witnessed the Lisbon earthquake in the 30s, it would have been very hard to rationalize this in any way and say that this was God's good and gracious will, fully and completely. If your doctor told you today that in the flower of your youth you didn't have very long to go, that you were a terminal case, the chances are very good that you would do very little leaping up and praising God, I would suspect anyway. Though 6 months from now, you might be able to accept the cruel reality of death, but you would hardly perhaps be able to give a rational and a reasonable explanation why such things happen. Now, some of us in the church have attempted carefully and devoutly to explain suffering, to give it some rationale. There are many ways to try to explain it. No suffering is meaningless, it's asserted. Well, for one thing, there is an afterlife, but this is hardly convincing or comforting to many, at least to many students. Students would retort in the words of the Rubaiyat, "O threats of hell and hopes of paradise, one thing at least is certain, this life flies. One thing is certain and the rest is lies. The flower that once has blown forever dies." Strange, is it not, that of the myriads who before us passed the door of darkness through, not one returns to tell us of the road which to discover we must travel to? Oh, this is a bit skeptical, to be sure. There are other ways to talk about suffering and to give it rationale. For example, suffering can work out for the good. There is a transmutability of suffering into good. It is suggested that we become better persons because of our own suffering or the suffering of others, their pain. Kierkegaard makes a great philosophical contribution because he bears the guilt of his father's infidelity. And Socrates dies in Athens for the glory of Greece and for the enlightenment of all mankind. And John Keats suffers consumption, and because of it he weaves beautiful poetry of anguish. My heart aches and a drowsy numbness pains my senses, though of hemlock I had drunk. Perhaps man shall always try to find a reason why things happen as they do. It is, however, quite possible that there is no such thing as a rational explanation for suffering. It may be that we do stand dumb with that best bootless cries to a deaf heaven. There may be no reasonable answer. There may be no reasonable answer because it can in no way be demonstrated rationally that suffering in all cases is justified. In no way can it be demonstrated that benefits from suffering outweigh the loss in the long run. It can be in no way demonstrated, it seems to me, that the good inevitably in the long run outweighs the loss. And it is this sense of loss of explanation which governs to a degree our contemporary sense of the death of God. We do stand with a vast sense of ignorance about things. The question asked by the Lord of Job is indeed asked of us. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? It's important to note that Job does ask for an explanation for his suffering. He wanted to know, and he wouldn't stop until he could find some kind of an answer. But he receives no rational answer. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Presumably, this was enough. He heard God's voice and he was contented. Amen.